Hi, I'm Dr. Kat Clifford, and it's my pleasure to introduce our invited faculty lecturer, Dr. Nicole Muszynski.
Hello.
Dr. Muszynski, yes, we'll clap in second. Dr. Muszynski is assistant professor of psychology. She graduated from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and began teaching as an adjunct in Hawaii at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Kapoliani Community College, and Honolulu Community College. She then went on to teach at Wabash College in Indiana as a visiting professor before coming to Hastings in 2020, where she regularly teaches courses ranging from animal cognition, behavioral neuroscience, to research methods and learning and memory. Nicole was on the committee that hired me in 2022. And I remember, thank you. Thank you. I remember after my campus visit thinking that if I got the job, I'd really like to be friends with Nicole. So I'm lucky that I got both wishes. Those who know her will already understand that she's got a brilliant mind, a fabulously dark sense of humor, and a deep well of curiosity. She's passionate about science, especially animal cognition and learning and memory, her areas of specialization, and she has little tolerance for pseudoscience and snake oil salesmen parading as experts. Dovetailing with her interests in animals, Nicole is a dedicated pet parent to her Shiba Inu Mochi, who actually might be the cutest dog ever, and her cat, Little One. She also has lots of hobbies, including reading, video games, and intense jigsaw puzzle marathons on the weekend. But today, we'll get to hear about her passion for science advocacy. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Dr. Nicole Muszynski.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for being here. So before I get started, I just like to, and I do this in all my lectures as well, do a brief overview of kind of what we're going to talk about. So first, I want to share with you how I came about this topic, because it's very typical of a psychologist. Then I want to just briefly talk about Carl Sagan's book, The Demon-Haunted World. And then generally, most of the kind of lecture will be about scientific thinking and thinking like a scientist. And for example, we'll talk a little bit about what pseudoscience is, and then a little bit about cognitive biases, fallacies, and just general human error. And then I'll kind of leave you off with your own toolkit for detecting bamboozle or bogus things around you, and then I'll just have some conclusions. Okay, so how did I come about this topic? I took a long time to figure out what I wanted to do this lecture on. I spent far too long thinking about it. I'm passionate about many things, my areas of expertise like animal cognition and memory, but I'm also really passionate about like horror movies and reading and video games and how they intersect with psychology. These thoughts of like what I wanted to do my lecture on during the thoughts during the day started to invade my dreams at night. And so I started having dreams about what I wanted to lecture on. They weren't dreams about like being stressed about public speaking. They were just dreams about like, I will do this lecture or I'll do this topic. And so my first segue I thought it would be fun to do is just to talk briefly about Freud. So I'm sure you all know of Freud. He's known for many things like therapy, psychoanalysis, but he's also known for dream interpretations. And so what do I and other researchers think about Freud? Well, in terms of what he said about dreams, most psychologists generally view dreams as inherently meaningless. So even though the content or the topics of your dreams might be really interesting and you might see meaning in them, most research suggests today that they're inherently meaningless. They're really just byproducts of your neural brain activity while you're sleeping. And one thing that you do often when you're sleeping is you consolidate memories. So you form and store new memories. So it actually makes sense I was having dreams about lectures because it was my memories kind of waking up or kind of being activated during the night. So the first dream lecture topic that I had that I was convinced I'd do was psychology potpourri. And so every slide was going to be completely different. And so it would just be an amalgamation of all the things that I like in some random way. But I couldn't decide on what I wanted to include in the psychology potpourri and what I could leave out. And so one night, it wasn't until February 6th to be exact, I woke up at 4:26 and emailed myself the following topic. And I'm kind of impressed with myself that I was able to have an email header at 4:30. So it says, talk idea, candle in dark, Carl Sagan revisited. And so I was really surprised when I saw this when I woke up, because I was able to remember this and piece it together what I meant. But also I was surprised because I haven't thought about this book since I was in graduate school in 2008. And so that was just my neural activity telling me I wanted to do this. So the first step to do this lecture, I had to buy his book again and then start rereading it. So here we go. Who is Carl Sagan? And so this is Carl Sagan. And so if you do not know of him, he was an astronomer, a science advocate and communicator, as well as a TV show host and an author. He wrote several books, but probably his favorite of mine was The Demon-Haunted World, Science is a Candle in the Dark. And it was published just a year before his death in 1995. And so this book, if you haven't read it, it's worth reading. I'd probably put it in my top 100 books to read before you die list. It's very dense, and it covers a lot of things, and a lot of things that also could upset a lot of people. And it's not possible in the time frame for this lecture to kind of talk about everything that's in the book, but I figured I could talk about some of the main points I got when rereading it, and also kind of add other kind of things that I thought might be relevant. And so this book was an inspiration for me, and so hopefully you get some kind of inspiration out of it as well. So the main goal kind of what we're really talking about here is just the importance of thinking like a scientist, not necessarily knowing about scientific facts, but just general ways of thinking like a scientist. So why is scientific thinking relevant for you? You might not be interested in anything related to science. You might not want to take science classes or go on to have scientific kind of careers, but whether you acknowledge it or not, science touches every aspect of your life. And so scientific advances are all around us. The electricity that we have, the technology that we're relying on right now, medications that you might need, hygiene products, beauty products, the food you consume, animals that we love and care for, it's literally everywhere. And another thing why it's good to think about these things is that a lot of scientists' work go unseen and unrealized. And so my favorite scientist to kind of use it as an example here is Norman Borlaug. And so if you don't know of him, he's a man who received a lot of admiration and praise. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for his research on GMOs and wheat, but he's a man that's often credited of having saved over 1 billion people's lives because he was able to make a higher yielding wheat crop so it could help starvation, prevent starvation. And so while a lot of scientists and people in this kind of area know of Norman Borlaug, a lot of just normal people don't, right? And so it's important to think about these people. The next thing that really stuck out for me is thinking about what science gives us besides everything around us. It gives us the gift of life. And like Carl Sagan said, the precious offering from science to humanity is nothing less than the gift of life. And I know myself, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for scientific advances. I would have died long ago from childhood illness. And so why is this important for everyone? Well, misinformation's everywhere. And so, for example, I was driving a few weeks ago, listening to the radio, because I'm boring and listen to the radio, even though I hate ads, and an ad came on. And I've heard this ad before, but this was the first time I actually listened to the ad. You might have heard this ad. I think it was on like 105.6 or whatever the radio channel is. And it was an ad for hypnosis therapy, which could, with 100% guarantee, it says in the ad, cause you to lose weight and stop smoking. And so I immediately kind of thought about this, and it was also interesting at the same time I heard this. I was rereading Carl Sagan's book, and his first chapter also opens up with him telling the kind of reader about his experience in a taxi cab talking about pseudoscience or misinformation. So I thought it was very relevant, a coincidence. And so I had many thoughts listening to this ad. The first few were kind of angry. And so my first thought was, how could somebody make an ad like this to profit off of other people's struggles? My other thoughts were, why would somebody waste money on this kind of scam? And then, after kind of having those thoughts, I was like, well, we can't fault individuals who fall for these scams, although we might be able to fault the people who make the ads. And so like Carl Sagan also notes in his kind of experiences talking with people who kind of tell him about misinformation or pseudoscience, he says it's really a fault of kind of the educational system in society. It's not necessarily an individual's fault. And so another segue I wanted to just briefly mention, since I have a picture of the word hypnosis, and I just talked about the hypnosis ad. How is hypnosis a pseudoscience? Or misinformation. And so that's the tricky thing about pseudoscience. It's sometimes not one thing. It can just be using a therapy or a product or an idea beyond its efficacy or its mean. And so hypnosis might have some valid ability to help certain individuals in certain cases, but there's probably a lot of missing information on whether it can do anything for things like weight loss, with especially 100% guarantee. So, pseudoscience, which is really just a type of misinformation, really. It's all around us, but what is it? And so I tried to come up with a really general definition myself, and it's really hard to think of definitions of some things because you try to encompass like every kind of example you can think of, but this is kind of what I came up with. So it's some kind of claim that claims to be scientific in a way, but it might not have any good backing by a current scientific discipline, or it's something in the case of like hypnosis that is misused or misinterpreted or used beyond its means or efficacy. And so using something, for example, like hypnosis as a panacea or a cure-all would be a good example of pseudoscience. And so there's lots of examples of pseudoscience around us. This is the list I'm sharing with you that Carl Sagan gives early on in his book. It's definitely not exhaustive. And so ESP, extrasensory perception, UFOs, or now we call them UAPs, things that are supernatural or paranormal, things like Bigfoot could be considered pseudoscience. Palmistry is where you read kind of your lines on your hand. Numerology is kind of when you read into dates and numbers and how they're related to your personality and things. Astrology is also considered pseudoscience. Homeopathy is basically a fancy word for like all natural medications, ghosts, and channeling. And again, like pseudoscience, there might be some bits and pieces of truth in some of these pseudoscientific kind of areas. It's really just how it's used that can be pseudoscientific as well. And I do want to note that every scientific discipline has its own pseudoscientific claims. Psychology, I feel I might be biased as a psychologist, but I feel like psychology is filled with them. Sometimes you might think of these as even like folk psychology. It's the kind of fun things you see where people are trying to use psychology principles to explain aspects of their behavior, but they're doing it kind of in a wrong way. Or you could even think of them as like the myths of psychology. Those are kind of like pseudoscience as well. So one of the most pervasive myths, there's a lot of them, related to psychology is that we only use 10% of your brain. We actually use all of our brain all the time, or you'd be dead. Your brain controls breathing and digestion and a lot of things that are unconscious and you don't think about. Another really good example that's related to psychology is phrenology. And like most pseudosciences, a lot of all pseudosciences, or some of them actually, I don't want to say all, they have bits and pieces of truth. So phrenology is when they used to basically read bumps on your head, and depending on where you had a bump, or if you had a small forehead or a large forehead, etc., you might have one type of personality or another, or if you had a bump back here, maybe you're going to be angry or suicidal or just something. They had all different kind of ways of reading the kind of skull. And there's some hints of truth in phrenology. Phrenology actually started around the same time people were looking at the brain and different brain areas and whether different brain areas had different important functions, which they do. So they take bits of truth, right, scientific truth, and they kind of blend it with things that aren't truthful. That's kind of what a pseudoscience is. And so this is also important to acknowledge in regards to talking, especially about pseudoscientific therapies or medications, for example, that some pseudoscience can actually have real physiological effects on an individual, but the effects that might happen are not from the substance itself. So for example, if you went to a doctor and you had a really bad headache, they could give you, it would be unethical to do this, but they could give you a sugar pill. So it's inert, it has nothing actually in it, but if you think it's going to help you, you can actually experience improvement, right? So that's essentially what a placebo effect is. And they're very real and they're very powerful. And scientists and researchers right now don't quite understand the complexity of why some things have placebo effects and some don't. It's likely a combination of many things, including things like genetics, your biology, as well as things like expectations, motivations, and your learning. And I do want to note that there's also what are called nocebo effects, which are essentially the opposite of placebo effects. It's when you think something's going to have a negative impact on you, so it does. So it makes you feel bad. So pseudoscience is everywhere. I know I can't walk into the grocery store or the drugstore without seeing some kind of product on the shelf, especially the drugstore. And so I have some examples up here that kind of showcase an example of a pseudoscientific medication that you might find at a drugstore. Just walk down the kind of vitamin aisle or where you'd get cough and cold medicine, and you can see some. And so what can you do? If you're concerned or you want to avoid these products or just think about something more deeply before you purchase it, what can you do as a consumer to stop being bamboozled? And so one of the first things you can do is be skeptical or think deeply, critical about something. Maybe don't just put something in your shopping cart because the product looks good. Another thing you can do, especially with medication kind of stuff, is you can look for product labeling, which are required by the FDA. And so I have on the picture, it's zinc cold therapy. If you look really closely, and it's hard to see in this image because it's small, but it says homeopathic. If it says homeopathic, then the following warning from the FDA would be applicable. You might also see things that aren't necessarily substances you take that could be considered pseudoscientific medications, like copper wristbands. I don't know if they're as popular as they were 20 years ago, but people used to put these wristbands on, and the product basically would claim to help with all sorts of things, from diabetes to helping you with headaches to all sorts of things. So I mentioned one of the things you could do is be skeptical, but what is skepticism? And so this is the following definition from the dictionary. So it's somebody who doubts doubts something. It could be a product, a claim, a piece of information you hear. That's generally skepticism. I like to add, to be scientifically skeptical, you just want to think deeply about something, critically. So that's generally what skepticism is. What is not skepticism is refusing to listen to other people, being too critical, right? If you're too critical, you're no longer being a skeptic, you're being a foul word. So why do we have so much pseudoscience around us? It sells. Carl Sagan says pseudoscience sells. People rely on, sell, buy, and hold pseudoscientific ideas all the time because it's profitable, it's easy as well. And Carl Sagan likes to note, it's because society, like I kind of mentioned, has failed us. It's failed to teach us the importance of thinking like a scientist. And so he really makes it clear in his book, and I want to make it clear too, sometimes it's not the facts of science that are necessary that we should all try to strive to know about. It's just the way of thinking, the scientific method behind things, if you. And so I also want to note that pseudoscience, it's not a current problem. It's a historical problem. And so Kat mentioned this. Snake oil salesmen have a long and really interesting history. It's pretty xenophobic, too, when you start to read into how snake oil salesmen came about. And so these were basically people who would peddle diluted things in jars called elixirs or snake oil, and they were essentially cure-alls, right? This product can cure X, Y, Z, T, E, F, right? It can cure everything. Why pseudoscience is around us so much too, and this was also noted by Carl Sagan, is that our major institutions have little scientific literacy. And so at the time his book was published in 1995, about 1% of Congress had some kind of background in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, or math. And today, of the 535 members of Congress, about 47 individuals have a STEM background. And that equates to about 8 to 9%. And these are people who are responsible for a lot of policies, right? Especially policies about science and education. And so Carl Sagan raised an excellent question: who benefits from this? Rather, who benefits from keeping the masses less informed about science? And I think I can think of answers myself. Carl Sagan also hinted to answers to this question. I think it's a little too political for invited lectures, so that's something to come up and ask me about or talk to me, in my office hours about. It's also slightly opinionated. We also, why there is pseudoscience around us or misinformation, I'm kind of using them interchangeably, because pseudoscience really is just a subtype of misinformation. Why is it all around us? We can't help ourselves, right? The effects of the media are very large, right? We can see things, we're exposed to information on TV, streaming services, social media, the news all the time. We're bombarded by information. And so these are some things you can think about to protect yourself from being bamboozled. So first, just because somebody's in a position of authority, even me, right? I have my own biases. Everything I say is not 100% truthful, I'm sure. And so just because somebody's in a position of authority doesn't mean they're accurate about everything all the time. Another thing to think about, it sounds compelling. So just because something sounds compelling doesn't mean it's accurate, right? So oftentimes really good pseudoscience intermixes real science with fake science, and it's really hard to disentangle them. And so if you start practicing healthy skepticism, right, and not have just blind belief of everything you see or hear, it can help protect you. Something you need to be thinking about while you're doing this, and this is something we should all be thinking about as well, is that we should be aware of the need to have tangible, immediate benefits of everything. So think about science. Think about kind of what gets funded in science and if it's applicable to humans or not. And so much of science and scientific research doesn't have immediate benefits for humanity. That is, a lot of science that's being conducted is called basic science. So for example, studying honeybee color vision could be an example of a basic science. Basic science doesn't have any direct, that we know of, applications to humanity, but it's still important for many reasons. One is we don't have foresight. We can't tell the future, and we don't know how this type of research could potentially benefit us in the long run. And a hint, any kind of study that's done on vision could actually help us. Think of artificial intelligence, robotics. We might, understanding an invertebrate's color vision could help us make better self-driving vehicles, right? And so another reason why just science and research is important, especially basic science, is that one goal of a lot of research is just to help learn more about where we live, like the nature around us. And so sometimes people think that science can be a little bleak. And if you start to see beauty in it, you can start to see that it's not all so bleak, right? A lot of science, especially basic science, wants to just discover truths about the world, right? Our world is really complex and chaotic. And then in regard to the no benefit to us kind of thing for basic science, or some basic science might not have any direct benefit to us, that's not entirely truthful, because we know lifelong learning, whether you're learning English or philosophy or about religion or science, right, can actually help us all, but it won't help us until later on when we're older. So just lifelong learning and education for yourself can actually help prevent or lower your risk of getting certain forms of dementia, like Alzheimer's. And that's why I have this picture, Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of research about what might cause Alzheimer's disease. One of them is an accumulation of plaques. Think like plaque on your teeth, but it's on your brain. And it basically, I'm kind of summing this up in a nutshell, but it basically kind of the plaques on your brain can kill off neurons in your brain, and that can contribute to memory loss and dementia. But lifelong learning, right, can help lower your risk of dementia, and it can do so by neurogenesis, when you learn about things, you can actually create new neurons, right? So why do so many people believe weird things? I have weird beliefs too. Why do so many of us believe weird things? It's also a title of another interesting man's book. But what cognitive psychology has taught us about why people might believe weird things is that humans are generally error-prone. And we're error-prone for a lot of reasons. One way that we're error-prone is that we regularly fall for optical illusions. And so shown here is a picture of one of my favorite optical illusions. It's really simple. So if you look at this kind of middle image, it asks you which square is brighter, A or B. So A should look brownish to you, and B should look orangish to you. Which one? They look like they're different colors and different brightnesses, but in fact, they're actually the same color. And it was actually really hard to show you that they're the same color. I basically had to block out all the information around it to show you they're the same color. So why does your brain play this trick on you? It's because your brain's really good about kind of synthesizing information it's learned from the past when you look at current information. So everything you've been exposed to throughout your life about brightness and how you see images can actually interfere with what you're really seeing. So your eyes or your brain is deceiving you. We also have lots of cognitive biases that are unconscious, and usually they're unintentional, and we can't really control them. And so of the many cognitive biases that we have, confirmation bias is probably the one most relevant for the purpose of this lecture. So generally, confirmation bias is when you are arguing with somebody or looking for information. It's when you tend to only look for information that confirms your existing beliefs or viewpoints. I have my own confirmation biases. I think video games are 100% good for you. They're never bad for you. And so how do we deal with confirmation bias? First, you have to acknowledge that you have it. And then you have to, and it's difficult, you have to make an attempt to deliberately seek out information that goes against kind of your biases. So in my example, if I was writing a research paper on video games, I'd probably want to make sure I included a good amount of research that's for video games, that show it's good for us cognitively, and I'd also want to show how it can actually be detrimental in the short run too. Humans can also be swayed by what are called logical fallacies. There are lots of logical fallacies. I'm just showcasing 2 here so you can kind of have them in your toolkit. An ad hominem, or against the person kind of fallacy, is when you attempt to discredit somebody's viewpoint or argument by attacking the person or the source. So if you look at the bubble on the right, if you're talking with somebody and they say GMOs are safe to eat. So a GMO is a genetically modified organism, and so GMOs are safe to eat. And your friend goes, "You're a Monsanto shill," right? That would be an ad hominem attack. So instead of discussing the validity of the evidence or safety in regards to GMOs or talking about that kind of stuff, you're just attacking the person themselves. Another logical fallacy is the appeal to emotion, and this one I think is really hard to avoid. And so this is where you basically use emotions, positive or negative, to persuade in the absence of evidence, right? So if we look at the fear kind of bubble on the left, it says, don't vote for them or that person, you won't be safe. Or you could look at the happiness one, buy this product, it will make you feel great, right? That would be an appeal to an emotion. Instead of talking about whether the product's safe or if there's any kind of evidence that it works, etc., you just talk about an emotional kind of feeling from it. Another thing that happens is it's really hard to avoid reading into anecdotes. So anecdotes are personal stories, and so anecdotes are generally not regarded as very reliable sources of information. So a good example of an anecdote that you might hear, I hope not, but you might hear when talking with a friend, they could be like, I saw a UFO the other day. That would be an anecdote. It's a person's experience or story about something. And so anecdotes aren't reliable because we aren't reliable, right? Usually you need lots of objective kind of pieces of or sources of information to when you're talking about something or looking at information. So just somebody telling you they saw a UFO, or even if somebody has a picture of a UFO that they say they took, like me. I saw a UFO at Morrison Reeves, when in fact, any one of you could make a picture of a UFO. And so if you're interested, making a UFO picture is rather easy. You just need 2 people and some kind of object that you throw up in the air and you take a picture of it. And if you know anything about photography, I'm not a good photographer, but I do know about like human perception and vision. If you can try to like make the angle kind of, you shoot the object kind of angled upwards so it looks higher in the air, then it's probably actually only 10 feet in the air. You can play with human perspective, so it could look like it's actually a flying saucer. And so it's quite easy to make your own UFOs. And while I was thinking about kind of doing this lecture, I remembered that I've always been kind of obsessed, on a side note, with UFOs and just weird things that humans do and think and believe in. And so I thought I'd share with you a picture. I had to beg my mom for this, a picture of me in 2008 at Roswell, New Mexico, kind of the UFO capital of the United States. So that's me posing with the alien. Another thing, because we're kind of just generally talking about scientific thinking and pseudoscience and all these kind of things, another good thing you can think of if you want to protect yourself from being bamboozled is the idea of the alternative explanations, right? And so thinking about alternative explanations, especially when somebody tells you an anecdote, is a good way of practicing thinking like a scientist. So for example, if your friend Mary claims she was abducted by an alien, first, you probably don't want to be rude. Keep all of this to yourself, just think about it. And so thinking like a skeptic, one, anecdotes do carry little weight. So do be wary of Mary, right? And then secondly, think about an alternative explanation. Sometimes we call this the principle of parsimony. Sometimes it's called Occam's razor, although it's spelled a variety of different ways. So Occam's razor is the idea when you're faced with two explanations to choose the simpler of the two. And that's a good way of thinking like a scientist. Until you can disprove or show that the simpler explanation's not happening, that only then should you kind of move on to the other explanation. And again, all of this should be happening kind of internally. You don't have to be rude to Mary about her experience at all. And just acknowledge again that humans are fallible, right? We're error prone in many ways. So how can you prepare, or what can you include in your bogus detection or bamboozle kit? One, skepticism. Two, I haven't mentioned this, but it's good to talk about the burden of the proof. So the burden of the proof usually rests on somebody making a claim. So for example, if somebody makes a claim that they were abducted by an alien, they have the burden of the proof to show that that happened. You, the listener to Mary's kind of anecdote, don't have the burden of the proof to show that it didn't. Another thing that you can have in your bogus detection kit is just independent corroboration of facts using reputable kind of sources, right? Looking for peer-reviewed articles instead of TikTok. Trying to just beware again of human fallibility, like optical illusions. Your brain can mislead you, and we do fall for logical fallacies. Thinking about Occam's razor is a good thing. And just generally acknowledging the human error, right? And then lastly, something I haven't talked about as well is the idea of falsifiability, which is a term kind of coined by a philosopher, Karl Popper. And so falsifiability is the idea that if something in science is irrefutable, it's not good science. And so, for example, Freud is a good example. So Freud's dream interpretation, anything you said to Freud, he'd have an excuse, right? A but this. So you could never show him to be false. And so his kind of ideas of dream interpretations were unfalsifiable, right? So they're outside the realms of science. So Carl Sagan's book, actually, after rereading it, it's scarily relevant to today. It had very prophetical, after reading it, I wondered if he was a prophet, right? And so I wanted to share with you a really powerful quote that I saw early on in his book after rereading it. Finding the occasional straw of truth awash in a great ocean of confusion and bamboozle requires vigilance, dedication, and courage. But if we don't practice these habits of thought, we cannot hope to solve the truly serious problems that face us, and we risk becoming a nation of suckers, a world of suckers, up for grab by the next charlatan who saunters along. And then the last kind of real slide, I do want to emphasize be wary of being too skeptical. You also need a healthy dose of open-mindedness. You can't not listen to somebody, even if you want to dismiss them. Being a good scientist and thinking like a scientist, it's really hard because you have to be skeptical on one hand, but also open-minded. And there's many reasons for that. And it's not easy. It's not easy to look at your own biases and be aware of them and try to fight them yourself. And it's not easy to look for logical fallacies. It's definitely not easy to look for good sources. And it's not easy because your brain is all the time trying to play tricks on you. But it's definitely worth it. And another Carl Sagan quote that I really, really love is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so lastly, I just wanted to again say thank you, and also kind of related to, I want to thank my mom and stepdad, even though they couldn't be here, because we are vastly different in a lot of ways, but they always let me do my own thing despite that, and even still. And my stepdad, when I was about 12, gave me this plaque from Henry David Thoreau, and I actually still have it in my office, about marching to your own beat, essentially. And I wonder sometimes if that's the reason why I am the way I am today. And again, I just wanted to share, I've always been obsessed with kind of UFOs and science, especially atomic bombs. That was another topic I wanted to do. And so this is another kind of picture of my mom and I in New Mexico. And so thank you. And please, if you have any questions or come up to me afterwards, if you have anything you want to ask, thank you. Questions? Concerns? Has anybody read the Carl Sagan book? Do you love it as much as I do? I want to reread it. I said I reread it, but it's really dense. And so it would be a good book to have a kind of class on. And yeah, book club, science book club or something. Rachel. Yeah, I stopped having them. I didn't even have one last night, so that's good. Isn't it just the typical psychologist thing? I had a dream. I laugh. That's why I wanted to share it. So. Kat.
Can you say something about how you decided to get into psychology? And like you have these interests in science and all of these other kind of weird things or whatever. Well, what was the thing that made you kind of narrow your focus in that?
It was an undergraduate. I took a cognitive psych class, and the professor was obsessed with the skeptical people, like Michael Shermer. He wrote a book, Why People Believe Weird Things. And then when I read that, I went down this rabbit hole of Carl Sagan and other people and just thinking about these things. So, yeah. Good question.
Cool.
Yeah.
I know you said you didn't want to talk about politics, but let's just say theoretically, there's a director of health and human services of this. Maybe you get a lot of pseudoscience.
Yeah.
Like, what's your solution to something like that?
I mean, you basically have to ignore him.
But they're making the public policy.
I know. Well, hopefully it doesn't impact the things your doctors can still provide for you. I don't know if that helps. I don't know what we can do but elect somebody different. But at least you can know that, right, to be careful. Don't listen to their advice. Yeah, Bob.
On that topic, there's an article in the New York Times yesterday, I think, a nutritionist who was saying that she was wringing her hands and very unhappy with a lot of the things that he said, especially about vaccines, but that she really appreciated his skepticism towards the food industry and wanting us to take a second look at how to improve American health by, looking at the actual safety of food. And so I think if he were here, he would say, you're talking about me, I'm a skeptic.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's weird because the FDA plays a role in helping the safety of the pills and stuff we consume, but the USDA is in charge of our food. I wonder if a better solution would be it being one agency. Yeah.
I did have another question.
Yeah.
I've come across, there are folks who argue that this rational approach is actually too restrictive, and that by integrating the impact of personal experience and anecdotes and experiences of your friends,
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point, and that's why I had that slide, open-mindedness. So that should allow you to have a discussion, right? And I deal with kind of a similar issue in my own field where psychologists for a long time wanted to study animals in these really stringent, highly controlled laboratory experiments, and people were like, but animals don't live in cages naturally. We need to do the field things, the things you might not think are highly controlled, and you need them both. So we always need tight scientific control, but you need people to tell you about their experiences, because a lot of times anecdotes are a great way of starting science and thinking about it. So that's why it's hard. It's hard to really be skeptical and then go, I have to be open-minded too. Even when you don't want to, because you get really wed, especially in science. You're like, I really like this theory. How dare they? You're like, how dare they show that that's not always the case, right? So. Yeah?
Can I ask a question? So, I'm one of the people who read this book in high school.
You should reread it. It's worth it.
I forgot what the name of it was. There were two sayings books.
Yeah.
And that's the one where he said to Queen Victoria, said, I want my image displayed across all of the kingdom. People didn't know where to start because by the time TVs came around, people didn't finish half of the grades. I don't know.
There's a lot of history in this book for the history and philosophy.
So like, I'm thinking about the candle in the dark metaphor, and I'm wondering if you could say any more about, like, what is the dark, right? I always think of like witch trials. I think if you don't have science and the scientific method, you end up with, you can just say like, I think you're possessed by the devil. And
Yeah.
you kill her, and everyone's like, yeah.
Yeah, the dark is the media, the pseudoscience, the misinformation, the politics around us, right? And the candle is science. And so if, right, the candle starts to burn out, you're just overwhelmed with all the bad things that can happen. It also, I talked with a student earlier today. And again, it's not possible in an hour to talk about all these things, but science itself is a very Western approach, right? And so I'm completely ignoring all other, especially Eastern cultures that might not have some of these principles, but right, we're just talking about science and its relevance to the United States right now. So, but it's really, there's so much content even in this one topic. It's fun. Keeps us thinking. Yeah.
If you would like to make up your own pseudoscience,
Oh, I don't know. It honestly, there's so many options. It would probably be like talking with your pets. Yeah. I talk enough with my dog that, yeah. Probably be pet related. I think that would make a lot of money too. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. It was fun.